Okay, so this is a brief history of human-computer interaction, often shortened to HCI. So we're going to look through a semi-linear history of where human-computer interaction started and some of the approaches that we have up until this day. So this is going to be a particular look at the graphical user interface, or the GUI, and how that developed, as this is probably the most dominant and common form of human-computer interaction that we have. In fact, any devices that we use often use a screen currently, and will use a form of GUI, or graphical user interface. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to have a look and see where those came from. So this is a little quote here about studying the past. So we want to look at the past to see if we can figure out new futures. So the area of human-computer interaction doesn't go back that far, in fact, but there's been a rapid transformation of how it infects or infiltrates our lives on a daily basis. So this is a sketch of the Memex by Vannevar Bush in 1945. He wrote about a system that would allow us to retrieve and store knowledge information, and so he imagined a way that we'd be able to put this information into a system and retrieve it. And in fact, some of his comments in the As We May Think article in the Atlantic Monthly, which originally in fact was written in 1939, wasn't published until 1945, a lot of the things that he talked about in fact led towards what would be the World Wide Web, or hypertext, and that was back in 1945. Now at this time, obviously, computers were not small. They certainly weren't personal computers. They would often take up huge rooms and spaces. But in 1960, a guy called J.C.R. Licklider wrote a seminal piece called Man-Computer Symbiosis, in which he felt that in not too many years, human brains and computer machines would be coupled together very tightly, and that the resulting partnership will think of as no human brain has ever thought before, and processed data in a way that has not been processed before. So that was in 1960. Obviously, one of his immediate goals there was the fact that these computers were huge and that people had to share those resources. And so ways of being able to share and timeshare computing was important, and this idea of having some sort of input and output display for communicating information in real time was something that he considered. And so he really felt that man and computer would be able to come together, pretty rapidly. It didn't quite happen as fast as he felt, but these days, of course, when we use the iPhone and various other things, they are augmenting our thinking, and so this is something to consider. And a lot of these people here were looking at ways that we might extend our thinking through human-computer interaction, and really a symbiosis of those two opportunities. Of course, one of the original sort of screens that came around was from the PDP-1, and in fact it was the hardware used for playing the very first computer game on a mini computer called Space War, and it used a Type 30 precision CRT display. So here we had like sort of green dots that would appear on the screen, and in fact the screen was round, and it's one of the first instances, or close to one of the first instances, of having any type of graphical user interface. And this was, again in the 1960s, in this instance in Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 1963, Ivan Sutherland was inspired by the Memex, and what you'll see a lot of the time is that a lot of the history is actually inspiration from various parts come through in different manifestations. So there's a lot of information here that is kind of lent upon and learned upon. And he put together something called the Sketchpad in 1963, which was part of his PhD thesis. A lot of the GUI that we see was derived from the idea of the Sketchpad, and here you've got a couple of images where you'd be able to draw an object using a light pen, and then it had the opportunity to apply constraints and actually use a lot of inspiration towards modern computer-aided design, or CAD software, for developing architectural drawings and those kind of things. So there was a bunch of buttons on the left that allow you to apply constraints from the light pen. Also, it introduced the idea of object-orientated programming, which was a brand new thing, and this would go on to be one of the mainstay programming approaches that we have today. A very similar time in 1962, Doug Engelbart, inspired by Lick earlier on, wrote a SRI report in 1962 called A Conceptual Framework for Augmenting Human Intellect. And so he was looking again at how a computer might augment human intellect. And this again is in the 1960s. So at this point, this is what the computer scientists predominantly and this is coming out of the United States of America. Lick was working at ARPA, and so a lot of this was funded through the government and through army resources. And so this report was looking at how he might augment human intellect. Doug went on to showcase what is now known as the mother of all demos in the 9th of December in 1968. And this was at what's called the Augmented Human Intellect Research Center. And he gave a demonstration showcasing what he called the online system, or NLS. And this was this demo, which is well worth watching in detail, really introduced a whole host of features that we know today. It was at this point that the mouse was first shown. Here we had, he goes and creates a shopping list where you can delete and remove and move items around. He does a number of things that really are now standard on every computer that we use. So this is definitely something to look at. It's quite a long demo, but you'll get the idea. And again, at the beginning of the demo, he talks about the ability to have a computer that was always on and would work at the instant sort of reactions to you. And this was in 1968, and many argue that a lot of Doug's thoughts and things here are still to be realized up until this day, and some of the systems that he had were way ahead of its time. In 1972, again inspired by Engelbart and others, Alan Kay wanted to create something called the Dynabook, and this is actually a sketch of its concept. And he was looking actually in learning theories from Brunner and Papert around how we might use a digital tool for learning. And so he created what's called the Dynabook, and this obviously looks very much like a laptop or an iPad with a screen connected at the bottom. And this is in 1972, and he called it a personal computer for children of all ages, the Dynabook. And so we see here these kind of key people, Bush, Licklider, Sutherland, Engelbart and Kay, really inspired at this point by each other to push forward what would become personal computing. Ted Nelson there is another character to investigate and look up. So Ted Nelson invented terms hypertext and hypermedia, and is a forerunner to what would become the World Wide Web, but had some very different approaches to that. And in fact, again, a lot of people are looking at his work now and reinvestigating it with the level of computing they have to see whether there might be alternative interfaces there. So Ted Nelson, another person to really look up, and the Xanadu project, which is spelled with an X. Some other areas of interest connected to this is obviously MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, ARPA, and of course the ARPANET, which will be the forerunner for the internet. And we've mentioned there the Augmentation Research Center lab is another place to look. So this was all happening in the sort of 1950s, 1960s, where we were starting to see this idea of how computers and humans might interact together. We had some very crude graphical user interfaces, and of course Doug Engelbart's mother of all demos really did showcase that ability to not use programming, but have a visual interface that will allow you to interact with the computer. This is a Xerox Alto. It was the first computer designed from the inception to support a graphical user interface, which would later become obviously desktop metaphor. The CPU for this actually resided in the entire cabinet underneath, so a lot smaller than the computers prior to that, and this is in like 1973. So this is about a decade prior to actually mass market getting these graphical user interfaces, and they built the custom chip that would fit into that cabinet. So Xerox PARC is the place where the modern graphical user interface started, and it was started with the Xerox operating system, which we can see here, and you can see some obviously some key things that are very much like what we see today. This is actually an implementation of an operating system built on Smalltalk, which Alan Kay used for the Dynabook as well. So this again is through Xerox, and this is looking at the learning group. And Smalltalk was also, seen as an exemplifier of this human-computer symbiosis. So we see those links through right now from the 1960s into the 1970s. This is the Xerox system, and what's key to understand here is that in 1979, Apple, under the sort of enthusiasm of Jeff Raskin, Steve Jobs visited Xerox, and they took a long look at what was the Xerox operating system and also what would be Xerox Star. So this is actually Apple Lisa, released in 1983, and a lot of the metaphors and things that we see from the Xerox system were quite clearly inspired and provided ways for Apple to release the Lisa in 1983. So this is probably one of the first sort of personal computers that is now becoming mass market. It was in 1984 that Apple released the Macintosh, which was built again up upon this concept of the graphical user interface. So that's menus, files, folders, these kind of things, really all born from Xerox PARC. It's in 1985 the first version of Windows is released, and again trying to borrow a very similar interface style, looking particularly at this point more towards the Macintosh. And in 1988, Next Step, which is the operating system that Steve Jobs, when he left Apple after the issues around, in fact, the Macintosh and other systems, he went on to form a company that built Next Step, which was a new operating system, and in fact this was a system that the World Wide Web would be invented on. But here you can see obviously some of the more icons, and again a very similar interface. Windows 3 released in 1990, again utilizing the same thing. At this point we're starting to get much more color involved. In fact, if you look at today's interfaces, we see Google, the Google Office suite here, really utilizing and taking advantage of what would be the implementation of Xerox Star's own sort of icons, graphical user interface. Not many things really have changed in that instance, other than the computers have become much more powerful. So a few things just to bear in mind and think about. And this is kind of a way to understand it, is Xerox PARC, particularly Star Office. Those interfaces really inspired the systems that went on to be the Apple Lisa and of course the Macintosh. Next Step took that to another level with Steve Jobs. Steve Wozniak and Jeff Raskin are also key players in the hardware and the implementation of these OSs. Often Steve Jobs is credited with these things, but of course it wasn't without others that he did the things that he did. Of course, we see the operating systems today evolve slightly, and Windows obviously 8 and Windows 10 is starting to push this kind of tile metaphor slightly more. But again, most of the operating systems that we undertake that are on computers currently, at least, perform the very, very similar stuff to the system that was created in 1978, 1979 at Xerox PARC, which is kind of interesting that we've had short history but relatively little change. In fact, the drag and drop, the files and folder metaphors are very, very similar. So that is a really rapid history of the human-computer interaction, particularly focused around where it started and the implementation of the graphical user interface. So a couple of things to reflect upon. So comparing current graphical user interfaces, what are the similarities that we see, and why do you think that is so? So there's lots of ways that we approach things. Why are they similar? And then maybe what are the biggest differences in the user interface that you see, and would that make you consider one platform over the other? Of course, touch interfaces and those kind of things are much more recent, and so there are slight differences to those. But what are the differences between, say, the Windows current operating system and the Mac OS operating system? And does that make much of a difference? And what are the similarities, and why do they have very similar ways of interacting? Okay, so that was a very brief history of how we've got to where we are in general terms with how we interact with computers through a myriad of screens.